They fired from the tops of banyan trees, from hollowed-out stumps, from positions so well camouflaged that search parties walked right past them. Every patrol that moved through the Point Cruz groves became a target. And then, crouching in the ruins of an abandoned Japanese bunker, watching the tree line through a scope his fellow officers had laughed at for months, Second Lieutenant John George made a decision. He would go hunting, not for the men his superiors ordered him to find, but for the snipers themselves. Before we continue with this incredible story, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. Now let's return to the jungles of Guadalcanal. John Burger George was not a typical Army officer. Born in 1915 in Illinois, he had grown up with a rifle in his hands. By the time he was a young man, he had become a state champion marksman, winning competitions across the Midwest with a precision that bordered on obsessive. George did not simply shoot. He studied shooting. He analyzed every variable, from wind drift to barrel harmonics, from trigger pull to the mirage effect, caused by heat rising from the ground. He read everything he could find on ballistics. He practiced until his shoulder was bruised and his eyes ached. For George, marksmanship was not a sport. It was a science. And when war came to America in December 1941, he believed that science would prove more valuable than any textbook ever taught at West Point. When George received his orders to ship out to the Pacific, he made an unusual request. He asked permission to bring his personal hunting rifle. It was a Winchester Model 70, chambered in .30-06, fitted with a telescopic sight he had purchased through the mail. His commanding officers were skeptical. The Army issued the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could lay down far more firepower than any bolt-action hunting gun. Why would an officer want to carry what they dismissively called a mail-order rifle into combat? George tried to explain. The Garand was excellent for infantry assaults, but for precise long-range shooting, nothing matched a properly tuned bolt action with a quality scope. His arguments fell on deaf ears. The other officers laughed. They called his Winchester a toy. They said he would abandon it the moment he heard his first Japanese bullet crack past his ear. George said nothing. He packed the rifle anyway. The 132nd Infantry Regiment arrived on Guadalcanal on December 8, 1942. They were part of the American Division, the first American division to be formed on foreign soil during the war. Their mission was to relieve the exhausted Marines who had been fighting on the island since August. The Marines had stopped the Japanese advance, but the enemy still held positions throughout the jungle interior. Mount Austin loomed over Henderson Field, and from its heights, Japanese observers could direct artillery fire onto the vital airstrip. The Army's job was to push the Japanese out permanently. George's first weeks on Guadalcanal were spent on defense, guarding Lunga Point while other battalions launched the assault on Mount Austin. The fighting was brutal. The Japanese had constructed an elaborate defensive position called the Gifu, a maze of bunkers, tunnels, and interlocking fields of fire. American units threw themselves against these defenses day after day. Casualties mounted. Progress was measured in yards. George listened to the distant sounds of combat and waited for his turn. He did not have to wait long. The 2nd Battalion received orders to execute a flanking maneuver around the main Japanese defenses. They would push inland, capture Hill 27, and cut off the enemy's line of retreat. George led his platoon through jungle so dense that men could pass within 10 feet of each other without making visual contact. The heat was suffocating. Insects swarmed around every wound, every scratch, every drop of sweat. And somewhere in that green hell, Japanese soldiers waited with rifles trained on every likely avenue of approach. During the fight for Hill 27, George began to understand why his Winchester might prove useful after all. The jungle fighting was close and chaotic, ideal for the Garand's rapid fire. but there were moments, brief windows, when he spotted Japanese soldiers at distances beyond effective Garand range. 300 yards, 400 yards, figures moving between trees, officers conferring, machine gun crews setting up positions. With his scoped Winchester, George could reach out and touch these targets when no one else could. He began volunteering for observation duty, taking positions where he could watch and wait. Hill 27 fell after days of hard fighting. The battalion pushed west, driving toward Point Cruz and the beaches beyond. The Japanese were retreating, but they were not broken. They left behind snipers, skilled marksmen hidden in positions designed to slow the American advance. These rearguard snipers were different from the ordinary Japanese infantry. They were patient. They were disciplined. They fired only when they had a certain kill, then relocated before anyone could pinpoint their position. And they were devastatingly effective. By mid-January, the sniper problem had reached crisis proportions. Patrols that should have been routine turned into death traps. Men were afraid to move during daylight. Officers were being specifically targeted, their rank insignia serving as aiming points for enemy rifles. The jungle around Point Cruz became known as a place where Americans died mysteriously, picked off by enemies they never saw. Something had to be done. George studied the problem the way he studied everything, methodically. He observed the terrain, analyzed the reports of sniper incidents, and tried to put himself in the mind of the enemy shooters. Japanese snipers, he realized, were not superhuman. They were well-trained marksmen operating from excellent positions, but they had weaknesses. They tended to remain in one location too long, confident in their camouflage. They fired from trees, which gave them good fields of view, but limited their ability to relocate quickly. And most importantly, they created patterns. Every sniper had habits, tendencies, preferred shooting lanes. If you watched carefully enough, you could predict where they would be. On January 22nd, George put his theories into practice. He positioned himself in the ruins of a destroyed Japanese bunker, approximately 200 yards from the tree line, where most of the sniper activity had been reported. He set up his Winchester on a rest made from sandbags, adjusted his scope for the range, and began to watch. Not scan, watch. There was a difference. Scanning meant moving your eyes constantly, looking for obvious signs of the enemy. Watching meant focusing on specific points, studying subtle changes in the environment, waiting for movement that did not belong. The morning passed in stillness. The jungle steamed under the tropical sun. George's uniform was soaked through within the first hour. Insects crawled across his hands, his face, the back of his neck. He did not move. He barely blinked. 240 yards distant, a massive banyan tree rose above the surrounding vegetation. Something about that tree drew his attention. The foliage was too thick in one section, the shadows too dark. He watched that spot for 3 hours before he saw it. A glint, metal reflecting sunlight for the briefest instant. Then, slowly, the barrel of a rifle emerged from the leaves. George did not rush his shot. He controlled his breathing, letting his heartbeat slow, until he could feel the space between each pulse. He placed his crosshairs on the patch of shadow where the rifle barrel originated. He waited for movement, confirmation that a human body was attached to that weapon. The leaves shifted. A face appeared, dark eyes scanning the American positions below. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper tumbled from his perch and crashed through the branches to the jungle floor. For a long moment, nothing happened. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then, from a different position, perhaps 100 yards to the left of the first sniper, a muzzle flash. A bullet cracked past George's head, so close he felt the shock wave against his ear. The Japanese had a second sniper, and now that sniper knew exactly where George was hiding. George rolled away from his firing position, pressing himself against the bunker's concrete wall. His ears were ringing. His hands, for the first time, were shaking. This was not target shooting anymore. This was a duel. If you are finding this story of courage and skill compelling, take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories of heroism to light. Now let us continue with Lieutenant George's deadly game of cat and mouse. The second sniper had made a mistake. By firing at George, he had revealed his approximate position. George forced himself to think clearly, to push through the adrenaline flooding his system. He had seen the muzzle flash, but the shooter had probably already moved. Japanese snipers were trained to relocate after every shot. George needed to predict where the man would go, not where he had been. He visualized the terrain. If he were that sniper, what would he do? He would move to a position that still covered the American bunker, probably deeper into the tree line, using the thick vegetation for concealment. George waited 20 minutes before he moved. He shifted to a new position within the bunker, one that gave him a different angle on the tree line. He scanned the vegetation systematically, section by section. Nothing. The jungle was too dense, too full of shadows and false shapes. Then he noticed something that did not belong. A branch that hung at the wrong angle, as if weight had recently been placed on it. He studied that spot, watching the shadows beneath. After another 10 minutes, he saw the outline of a helmet, barely visible through the leaves. The second shot was more difficult than the first. The target was partially obscured, and George had to estimate where the sniper's body would be based on the helmet's position. He aimed lower and to the right, where the torso should be if the man was prone. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester cracked. Through his scope, he saw the foliage shudder violently. No further movement came from that position. 2 down. But George knew there would be more. Japanese snipers rarely operated alone. They worked in pairs or small teams, providing mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. Somewhere in that jungle, other eyes were watching, other rifles were waiting. George settled in for what he knew would be a long day. By late afternoon, he had identified and eliminated 2 more snipers, 4 kills in roughly 8 hours. His ears still rang from the near miss that morning. His eyes ached from hours of intense observation. His throat was parched, but he had not risked movement to drink from his canteen. Every time he thought about water, he reminded himself that somewhere out there a Japanese soldier was thinking the same thing, and whichever of them made a careless movement first would die. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back to the battalion command post. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted a report. George carefully withdrew from his bunker, moving low and slow, never presenting a silhouette against the skyline. He reported to the captain with the clinical detachment of a scientist presenting research findings. 4 confirmed kills. 8 rounds expended, 4 hits, 4 misses against secondary targets that had moved before he could fire. The captain nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that the mail-order rifle was not a joke after all. The next morning, George was back in position before dawn. He had chosen a different location, a shallow depression near the edge of the American perimeter that offered a clear view of the coconut grove where the Japanese snipers had been operating. The early light was gray and diffuse, filtering through the morning mist that rose from the jungle floor. George lay motionless, his Winchester cradled against his shoulder, watching the tree line emerge from shadow. The 5th sniper revealed himself at 0700 hours. He fired at an American working party that had ventured too close to the perimeter, wounding a soldier in the shoulder. George saw the muzzle flash and triangulated the position. The shooter was in a coconut palm, approximately 300 yards out, using the fronds as cover. George adjusted his scope, calculated the slight upward angle, and fired. The Japanese soldier fell, his rifle clattering through the branches behind him. By midday, George had added 3 more kills to his tally. 8 snipers eliminated in 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 confirmed hits. His accuracy under combat conditions matched his competition shooting, a testament to years of practice and an almost inhuman ability to remain calm under pressure. But the Japanese were adapting. The surviving snipers had recognized that they faced an enemy marksman of unusual skill. They became more cautious, moving more frequently, exposing themselves for briefer intervals. The easy kills were over. The 9th sniper nearly killed George. It happened on the afternoon of the 2nd day. George had been watching a suspicious position for over an hour when he caught movement from his peripheral vision. He turned his head just as a bullet cracked past, so close that it tore the fabric of his collar. The shooter was behind him to the left in a position George had not considered. The Japanese had anticipated his location and set up an ambush. George threw himself flat, pressing his body into the earth as a second bullet kicked up dirt inches from his head. Lying face down in the dirt, George's mind raced. He was pinned. The enemy sniper had the angle on him. If he moved, he would die. If he stayed, he would eventually die anyway, once the Japanese worked up the nerve to advance on his position. He needed to change the equation. His eyes scanned the ground in front of him, looking for anything he could use. His hand closed around a rock, about the size of a baseball. He waited until he heard the enemy shift position, then threw the rock as far as he could to his right. The rock crashed through the underbrush, sounding for all the world like a man fleeing through the vegetation. The Japanese sniper fired at the sound, revealing his position with the muzzle flash. George rolled onto his back, brought his Winchester up, and fired in a single fluid motion. The shot was instinctive, aimed more by feel than by sight. But years of practice had made that instinct precise. The Japanese soldier slumped forward from his hiding place, dead before he hit the ground. 9 kills. George lay in the dirt for several minutes, waiting for his heartbeat to return to normal. That had been too close. The Japanese were learning, adapting, trying to turn the tables on him. He needed to think differently, to anticipate their counter-adaptations. He realized that the survivors would now be expecting him to operate alone. They would be watching for a single American marksman. What if he changed that expectation? On the 3rd day, George requested a volunteer to act as his spotter. A young corporal named Hayes agreed, though he clearly had doubts about the mission. George positioned Hayes with binoculars while he set up with the Winchester at a different angle. Together, they would have overlapping observation of the remaining sniper positions. Hayes would spot targets that George might miss, and George would engage them before they could identify the 2-man team. The tactic worked. By noon of the 3rd day, Hayes had identified, and George had eliminated the 10th sniper. But one remained. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese had at least 11 snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves, and George had only confirmed 10 kills. Somewhere out there, the last sniper was waiting, and this one had survived 3 days of George's hunting. He was either very lucky or very good. George suspected the latter. The 4th day dawned cloudy, the sky heavy with the threat of rain. George took up position in a water-filled crater, a location so uncomfortable that no rational person would choose it as a firing position. That was exactly why he chose it. The Japanese sniper would be looking for him in the obvious spots, the bunkers and depressions that offered good cover and clear firing lanes. He would not expect an American to lie for hours in a muddy hole full of stagnant water and mosquito larvae. Hours passed. George lay motionless, the water seeping through his uniform, insects crawling across every exposed surface of his skin. He watched the tree line through his scope, searching for any sign of the final sniper. Nothing. The jungle seemed empty, peaceful almost, if you could ignore the distant sound of artillery and the occasional crack of small arms fire from other sectors. George began to wonder if the 11th sniper had withdrawn, if he had decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and retreated with the main Japanese force. Then Hayes whispered a warning. Movement, east, near the rocks. George shifted his scope and saw 2 figures emerging from the vegetation. 2 men, not one. The 11th sniper had brought support. Or perhaps these were the final two snipers, numbers 10 and 11, working together now that they understood they faced a deadly opponent. George watched them move into position, setting up behind a fallen log with a clear line of fire toward the area where George should have been hiding, the drainage ditch where he had operated the previous day. The Japanese had predicted his location. They had analyzed his pattern and positioned themselves to ambush him. But George was not in the drainage ditch. He was 38 yards away, lying in a muddy crater, invisible and unexpected. The two snipers were facing the wrong direction, their backs exposed. George had a clear shot at both of them, but he could not engage both before the survivor reacted. He needed to make a decision. George chose the closer target first. The shot was almost too easy, center mass at 38 yards. The first sniper collapsed without a sound. Before the second could react, George worked the bolt of his Winchester, chambered a new round, and fired again. The second soldier fell. The 11 shots fired over 4 days, 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. As George climbed out of the crater and moved toward the American perimeter, he heard a sound that made him freeze, rustling in the underbrush ahead. He dropped to one knee, bringing his rifle up, finger tightening on the trigger. A figure emerged from the vegetation. For a terrible instant, George nearly fired. Then he recognized the helmet, the uniform, the frightened face of an American private who had gotten separated from his patrol. George lowered his rifle, his hands trembling with the aftershock of nearly killing one of his own men. The private stared at him, at the mud-caked uniform and the wild eyes, and asked if George was okay. George did not answer. He was not sure. George walked into battalion headquarters and reported to Captain Morris. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers, 11 hits, 1 near miss. Morris stared at him for a long moment, then reached out and shook his hand. The officers who had laughed at George's mail-order rifle said nothing. They were beginning to understand that they had witnessed something exceptional, a display of marksmanship and tactical thinking that would become legendary among those who survived Guadalcanal. But George was not finished. He recognized that his individual success, while satisfying, would not solve the larger sniper problem facing American forces in the Pacific. Japanese snipers would continue to exact a toll on American troops unless the Army developed a systematic counter-sniper capability. George approached his superiors with a proposal. Let him train other men in the techniques he had developed. Let him create a sniper section that could replicate his success across the entire division. The brass was skeptical at first. Snipers were seen as ungentlemanly, a dirty form of warfare that did not fit the American self-image. But casualties were mounting, and George's results spoke for themselves. He received permission to form a small sniper section, 4 teams of 2 men each. He selected his candidates carefully, looking for patience, marksmanship ability, and the psychological stability to lie motionless for hours while waiting for a single shot. On February 1st, 1943, George took his 4 teams into the field for their first real mission. Their objective was to clear Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Intelligence indicated that small groups of Japanese soldiers were still operating in the area, stragglers who had not yet evacuated with the main force. George paired with Corporal Hayes, the same spotter who had assisted him during the final days of the Point Cruz operation. They set up on high ground overlooking a trail the Japanese had been using for resupply. At 07:20, a Japanese soldier appeared on the trail. Hayes confirmed the target through binoculars. George fired. The soldier fell. Over the next several hours, the 4 sniper teams engaged multiple targets across their sector. The Japanese, caught off guard by the coordinated sniper fire, began to panic. Their evacuation routes were no longer safe. Their rearguard positions were being systematically eliminated. The pressure on American infantry units eased noticeably as the Japanese shifted resources to counter the sniper threat. The Japanese evacuation accelerated during this period. Destroyers arrived at night to pick up troops from Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal. American forces pushed west to interdict the evacuation, but the Japanese fought effective rearguard actions. Georgia's sniper section was tasked with eliminating the soldiers covering the retreat routes. They operated around the clock, trading positions to maintain constant pressure on the enemy. By February 9, 1943, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The Japanese had completed their evacuation. The Guadalcanal campaign was officially over. Georgia's sniper section had operated for just 12 days, but in that time they had achieved 74 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties during any of the sniper operations. The section had proven that properly trained marksmen, operating with patience and discipline, could have an impact far out of proportion to their numbers. George continued to serve in the Pacific after Guadalcanal. He fought in the jungles of Burma and the mountains of China, refining his techniques and training others in the art of precision shooting. By the end of the war, he had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He had survived some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific theater. And he had changed the way the American military thought about marksmanship and sniping. After the war, George wrote a book about his experiences. He titled it Shots Fired in Anger, a reference to the difference between shooting at paper targets and shooting at men who shoot back. The book became a classic of military literature, praised for its honest assessment of combat, its detailed analysis of weapons and tactics, and its vivid descriptions of what it felt like to look through a scope at another human being and pull the trigger. George wrote without sentimentality or glorification. He described the fear, the exhaustion, the moral weight of taking lives. He also described the satisfaction of doing something difficult extremely well, of solving the tactical problem of the Japanese snipers when no one else could. In Shots Fired in Anger, George offered frank assessments of both American and Japanese military capabilities. He praised the M1 Garand as probably the best military rifle of the war, a weapon that gave American infantry a significant advantage in firepower. But he also criticized the Army's neglect of marksmanship training, its obsession with volume of fire over accuracy. He noted that many American soldiers arrived in combat zones barely able to hit a stationary target at 100 yards, let alone a moving enemy in dense vegetation. The Japanese, for all their failings, took marksmanship seriously. Their snipers were often better shots than their American counterparts. Only the intervention of exceptional individuals like George prevented that advantage from becoming decisive. George also analyzed the Japanese military with the detachment of a scientist. He admired their field craft and discipline, their ability to endure hardship and fight with limited supplies. He noted that Japanese soldiers were often physically smaller than Americans, which actually gave them advantages in jungle warfare, where a smaller target was harder to hit. But he also identified critical weaknesses. Japanese officers clung to outdated tactics, launching suicidal banzai charges that wasted lives without achieving objectives. Their rigid command structure made it difficult for junior soldiers to adapt to changing circumstances. And their contempt for surrender meant that valuable intelligence was rarely captured. American forces learned to exploit these weaknesses, but the learning came at a terrible cost in blood. The legacy of George's 4-day duel extends far beyond the jungles of Guadalcanal. His success demonstrated the value of precision marksmanship in modern warfare, a lesson that the military would repeatedly learn and forget and learn again over the following decades. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, American forces would encounter enemy snipers and would struggle to develop effective counter-sniper tactics. Each time they would rediscover principles that George had articulated in 1943. Patience, observation, understanding the enemy's habits, and predicting his movements. And above all, the confidence to take a single, well-aimed shot, rather than spraying ammunition in the general direction of the enemy. George himself faded from public attention after the war. He lived quietly, occasionally giving lectures on marksmanship and consulting with military organizations on sniper training. He never sought fame or recognition for his exploits on Guadalcanal. When asked about the 11 snipers, he would deflect, pointing out that many men had done far more difficult things during the war. He was right, of course. The Pacific War produced countless acts of courage and sacrifice that dwarf any individual accomplishment. But there was something uniquely compelling about George's story, something that captured the imagination of everyone who heard it. Perhaps it was the simplicity of the contest. One man against 11, armed only with a rifle and his wits, fighting not in the chaos of a mass assault, but in a series of individual duels where skill and nerve determined survival. Perhaps it was the vindication of the underdog, the officer whose rifle had been mocked proving its worth when it mattered most. Perhaps it was simply the thrill of watching a master craftsman practice his craft under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Whatever the reason, George's 4-day duel became one of the enduring stories of the Pacific War, a testament to what one trained and determined individual could accomplish against overwhelming odds. The 14 Americans who died in the Point Cruz groves before George began his hunt were never forgotten by those who served with them. They were the reason George volunteered for his mission, the reason he lay for hours in muddy craters and ruined bunkers, the reason he risked his life day after day to eliminate a threat that had killed his comrades. War, George understood, was not about glory or medals or heroic narratives. It was about protecting the men beside you, solving problems that cost lives if left unsolved. The snipers were a problem. George solved it. That was all. Today, more than 80 years after the guns fell silent on Guadalcanal, the island has returned to jungle. The bunkers where George hunted have crumbled into the earth. The coconut groves where Japanese snipers hid are overgrown and impenetrable. Only rusting relics and occasional bones remind visitors of the savage fighting that once consumed this place. But in military academies and sniper schools around the world, George's story is still told. His book is still read. His methods are still studied. The officer with the mail-order rifle who killed 11 snipers in 4 days has become a legend, not because he sought fame, but because he demonstrated a timeless truth. Skill, patience, and courage can overcome even the most daunting odds, and sometimes the most unlikely hero is the one who makes the difference between victory and defeat. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most remarkable individual combat achievements of the Second World War. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to the channel and share it with anyone who appreciates tales of courage and marksmanship. Leave a comment below letting us know what aspect of George's story impressed you most. And remember, the next time someone laughs at your unconventional approach, you are in good company. Lieutenant John George proved that sometimes the experts are wrong, and sometimes the mail-order rifle is exactly the right tool for the job. The morning air hung thick with humidity over Point Cruz. January 22nd, 1943. A crack, then silence. Another American soldier crumpled to the jungle floor, the 7th victim that week. Japanese snipers had turned this stretch of Guadalcanal into a killing zone. 14 men dead in 72 hours. The enemy shooters were invisible, patient, and utterly lethal.